This bear gave birth in their barn, but then did something no one expected. The mountains of Montana stood like ancient guardians against the pale winter sky, their peaks dusted with early snow that glittered in the morning light. Nestled at the edge of a sprawling pine forest, the small farmhouse belonging to Helen and Walter Pearson looked like something from a storybook, with smoke curling from its stone chimney and frost-covered windows reflecting the sunrise. At 65 and 67 respectively, Helen and Walter had lived in this quiet corner of the world for over 40 years, having purchased the property when they were newlyweds with dreams of raising a family close to nature. Those dreams had come true, though not in the way they had expected. Their 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and David, had indeed grown up with dirt under their fingernails and wonder in their eyes, but one by one they'd been drawn away by college, careers, and families of their own. Michael was an environmental lawyer in Seattle, Sarah taught biology at a university in Chicago, and David had followed his wife to Boston, where he worked as an architect. They called often and visited when they could, but the farmhouse that had once echoed with children's laughter now knew a different kind of quiet. Not that Helen and Walter were truly alone. Buddy, their 13-year-old golden retriever, had been with them since he was a puppy. His muzzle had grown white with age and his movements weren't as spry as they once were, but his warm brown eyes still held the same gentle wisdom they always had. He'd sired several litters in his time, and his latest 5 puppies, born to a neighbor's retriever, were now 3 months old and visited often, bringing chaos and joy to the old farmhouse. Going to be another cold one, Walter observed, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air as he stood on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee clutched in his weathered hands. Tall and lean with silver hair and kind blue eyes, he'd spent his working years as a forest ranger before retiring a decade ago. Helen joined him, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her petite frame. Her once auburn hair was now completely silver, though she kept it in the same practical bob she'd worn since her 30s. "The weather service says we might get that big storm tonight," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "I'd better check our supplies, make sure we're set if the power goes out." "I'll split some extra wood this morning," Walter nodded, "and check the generator." This was how they lived, in quiet harmony with each other and the rhythms of nature. Their days were shaped by simple tasks, tending to their small vegetable garden, now mostly put to bed for winter, caring for their modest livestock of 6 chickens and 2 goats, and helping the wild creatures that frequented their land. Helen maintained several bird feeders year-round and left out water for passing deer. Walter had constructed nesting boxes for various birds and small mammals. They took pride in being stewards of their little piece of wilderness. By mid-afternoon, the promised storm clouds were gathering, dark and heavy on the horizon. Walter had finished splitting a substantial pile of firewood and was stacking it neatly against the side of the house. Helen had baked bread, and a large pot of vegetable soup simmered on the stove, filling the house with warmth and comforting aromas. "Better bring in Buddy," Helen called from the doorway. "Storms coming in faster than they predicted." Walter whistled, and Buddy came trotting from the direction of the old shed, where the puppies were housed with their mother. The aging retriever moved with a slight stiffness, but his tail wagged as steadily as ever. "Good boy," Walter patted Buddy's head as the dog passed him into the warmth of the house. "All the pups accounted for?" Buddy gave a soft woof that both humans had long ago learned to interpret as affirmation. The storm hit just after dusk, bringing howling winds and snow that fell in thick, swirling curtains. Helen and Walter sat by the fireplace, she with her knitting, and he with a book of local history, while Buddy dozed at their feet. Outside, the world disappeared beneath a blanket of white, and the wind sang eerie melodies around the eaves of the old farmhouse. "Hope the wildlife has found shelter," Helen said, glancing toward the window where nothing was visible beyond the porch light's feeble glow against the blizzard. "They know what to do," Walter assured her, though his own eyes followed hers with concern. He'd spent enough years in these mountains to respect their power and the challenges they presented to all living things. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind nearly 2 feet of fresh snow and a world transformed into a winter wonderland. The sky was clear now, a brilliant blue that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Walter bundled up and went out to check for damage, while Helen prepared breakfast. "Shed roof held up fine," he reported when he returned, stomping snow from his boots in the mudroom. "Power lines are intact. We got lucky." "What about the puppies?" Helen asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast before him. "Happy as can be. Their mama kept them warm all night." Walter picked up his fork. "I'll need to clear a path to the chicken coop after breakfast." "I'll help," Helen said. "Then I want to put out some extra feed for the birds and deer. They'll be hungry after a night like that." It was nearly noon by the time they finished clearing paths to the various outbuildings. The sun had little warmth, but it made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like it was strewn with diamonds. Helen had just finished filling the bird feeders when Buddy, who had been helping Walter check the perimeter of their property, suddenly froze, his nose lifted to the wind. "What is it, boy?" Walter asked, noting the dog's unusual alertness. Buddy turned his head toward the old woodshed, a small structure separate from the main house where they stored tools and extra firewood. The golden retriever took a few steps in that direction, then looked back at Walter, clearly wanting him to follow. "Helen," Walter called, "Buddy's found something." Helen made her way carefully through the snow to join them. "What's going on?" "Not sure yet," Walter said, following as Buddy led them to the woodshed. The dog stopped at the partially opened door, whining softly. Walter approached cautiously, pushing the door open wider. The interior was dim, but enough light filtered through the small window to reveal the neat stacks of firewood along one wall and various garden tools hanging from pegs. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance. Then they heard a faint whimpering sound coming from the back corner, where some old hay was piled for insulation. "Someone's in there," Helen whispered, moving closer to Walter. As their eyes adjusted to the dimness, they saw movement in the hay. Walter reached for the flashlight he kept on a shelf by the door and directed its beam toward the corner. What they saw made them both gasp. There, nestled in the hay, were 2 tiny black bear cubs, no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open. They were huddled together, shivering despite the relative shelter of the shed. And beside them, raising her head weakly at the sudden light, was their mother, a thin black bear with matted fur and exhausted eyes. She made no move to rise, but they could see she was favoring her back right leg, which bore the scars of an old injury. "Oh my God!" Helen breathed, instinctively taking a step back and pulling at Walter's arm. "Walter, we need to go now." But Walter didn't move immediately. He was watching the mother bear, noting something unusual in her behavior. Despite their intrusion, she wasn't showing signs of aggression. There was no growling, no baring of teeth. Instead, she was looking at them with what could only be described as worry and fatigue, her eyes revealing a desperation that transcended species. "She's not threatening us," Walter said quietly. "Look at her, Helen. She's exhausted and injured." And those cubs, she could still be dangerous, Helen insisted, though her voice had softened as she too observed the bear's demeanor. Buddy, who had remained at their side, was watching the scene with unusual calmness. The old dog, who would normally alert them to any wildlife danger, seemed almost sympathetic as he gazed at the bear family. "I think she came here seeking shelter from the storm," Walter said. "And she's too weak to move her cubs right now." Helen's natural compassion began to override her fear. "Those cubs won't survive long if she can't feed them properly," she said. And with that injured leg and in her weakened state, the mother bear made a soft sound, not a growl, but a sort of whimper that echoed her cubs' distress. Then, in a gesture that would remain etched in Helen and Walter's memories forever, she laid her head back down, exposing her vulnerable neck, as if surrendering to whatever fate these humans might decide for her and her babies. "She's asking for help," Helen whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Walter, she's asking for our help." Walter nodded slowly. "Let's back out carefully. I have an idea." Once outside, they discussed their options in hushed tones. Calling wildlife services was the official protocol, but Walter knew from his ranger days that the response might not be what the bear family needed right now. "They'd likely tranquilize her and relocate them all," he explained. "In her condition, the stress might be too much." And if they deemed her too injured to survive in the wild, Helen understood the unspoken implication. "So what do we do?" Walter considered for a moment. "Let's try to help them where they are for now. She chose our shed for a reason. She feels safe here. Let's give her food and water, keep our distance, and see if she can regain her strength." "And if she becomes aggressive?" Helen asked. "Then we call for help immediately," Walter assured her. "But something tells me she won't. Did you see how Buddy reacted? He wasn't afraid." Indeed, their golden retriever was still sitting calmly by the shed door, as if standing guard. There was a knowing look in the old dog's eyes. That gave both humans pause. "All right," Helen agreed. "What should we feed her?" Walter thought back to his ranger training. "Bears are omnivores. We could start with some grain porridge, maybe mixed with a little honey, nothing too rich. Her system needs to adjust." While Walter prepared the makeshift meal, Helen gathered some clean hay from the barn. They approached the shed again, moving slowly and speaking in soft voices to alert the bear to their presence. The mother bear lifted her head again as they entered but still showed no signs of aggression. She watched warily as Walter set down the bowl of porridge within her reach, and Helen carefully added fresh hay to their bedding, staying as far from the bear family as the small space allowed. "There you go," Helen murmured, unable to help her instinct to comfort a mother in need. "This will help you stay warm and regain your strength." As they backed away, the mother bear's gaze followed them, not with hostility but with what seemed like a glimmer of understanding. Helen, already forming an attachment, found herself thinking of a name. "Shadow," she whispered to Walter as they closed the shed door partway, leaving enough space for the bear to exit if she chose. "We'll call her Shadow." Walter smiled at his wife, recognizing the same compassionate spirit that had made him fall in love with her decades ago. "Shadow it is," he agreed, "and we'll help her and her cubs as long as they need us." That night, as they prepared for bed, Helen stood at the bedroom window, looking out toward the shed. A soft light from the battery-powered lantern they'd left inside created a gentle glow against the snow. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked as Walter joined her. He slipped an arm around her waist. "I think we're following our hearts, and sometimes that's the only right thing to do." In the days that followed, a routine developed. Each morning and evening, Walter would prepare food for Shadow, gradually introducing more variety as her strength improved, while Helen refreshed their water and bedding. They were careful to maintain a respectful distance, never attempting to touch the bears or stay longer than necessary. Shadow seemed to understand the boundaries of this unusual arrangement. During the day, she would sometimes leave the shed, presumably to forage for additional food, but she always returned before nightfall. The cubs, whom Helen had named Smoky and Dusty, grew stronger daily, their curious eyes taking in the strange humans who brought sustenance to their mother. Buddy, meanwhile, had appointed himself guardian of the bear family. Whenever Shadow left to forage, the old golden retriever would position himself near the shed, keeping a watchful eye on the cubs. At first, Helen and Walter worried about this arrangement, but it soon became clear that a remarkable trust had formed between the domestic dog and the wild bear. "I've never seen anything like it," Walter confessed one evening as they watched from the kitchen window. Shadow had just returned from a foraging trip and was acknowledging Buddy with a gentle nod before entering the shed. "In all my years as a ranger, I never witnessed this kind of understanding between different species." Helen smiled, her eyes soft with wonder. Maybe they recognize something in each other. Both mothers who've raised young. Both protective. Both walls in their own ways. As weeks passed and January gave way to February, the bear cubs grew rapidly and began to venture outside the shed under their mother's watchful eye. Their playful antics brought joy to Helen and Walter, who observed from a distance to avoid interfering with their natural development. The first time the cubs encountered Buddy's puppies was purely accidental. Helen had brought the 5 young retrievers out for some exercise in the snow, not realizing that Shadow had allowed her cubs to explore the yard that morning. The puppies, bundles of golden energy, bounded through the snow toward the unfamiliar creatures with typical canine curiosity. Helen's heart leaped into her throat as she watched the encounter, ready to intervene if needed. But something remarkable happened instead. After an initial moment of surprise and caution on both sides, the young animals began a tentative interaction that soon evolved into play. The bear cubs, though still wobbly on their legs, batted playfully at the puppies, who responded with gentle nips and exuberant leaps. Buddy and Shadow observed from opposite sides of the yard, neither interfering but both clearly alert to any sign of trouble. When one of the more boisterous puppies became too excited and tumbled one of the cubs over, Shadow took a single step forward, but before she could react further, Buddy had already trotted over and nudged his offspring away with a corrective whine. The sight of these wild and domestic youngsters playing together in the winter sunlight brought tears to Helen's eyes. It was as if they were witnessing something profound, a glimpse of a world where the boundaries between wild and tame, between different species and different ways of being, dissolved into something simpler and more beautiful. "Walter," she called softly, not wanting to disturb the scene, "come see this." Walter joined her at the window, his arms slipping around her shoulders as they watched the unlikely playmates tumble in the snow. "Would you look at that?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Just look at that." As February progressed, Shadow's health improved dramatically. Her limp, while still noticeable, no longer seemed to pain her as much, and her coat had regained its glossy sheen thanks to the nutritious food Helen and Walter provided. The cubs were thriving, growing rounder and more coordinated by the day. The impromptu play sessions between the bear cubs and the retriever puppies became a regular occurrence, always under the supervision of both Buddy and Shadow. A rhythm developed. The humans would go about their daily tasks, maintaining a respectful distance but always aware of their wild guests, while the animals created their own society with rules and boundaries that transcended species. One particularly mild afternoon, Helen was hanging laundry on the line when she noticed something unusual. Smokey, the more adventurous of the cubs, was playing a bit too roughly with the smallest of Buddy's puppies, causing the little golden retriever to yelp in distress. Before either Helen or Shadow could intervene, Buddy himself trotted over. Instead of scolding or separating them, however, the old dog simply picked up a frayed rope toy that the puppies often played with and dropped it between Smokey and the whimpering puppy. He nudged it with his nose, demonstrating a gentle tug-of-war motion. Smokey, after a moment's consideration, grabbed one end of the rope, while the puppy, recovering quickly, seized the other. Helen stood frozen, the damp sheet forgotten in her hands as she watched Buddy effectively teach the bear cub a more appropriate way to play, not through fear or punishment, but through gentle guidance and example. "Walter's not going to believe this," she whispered to herself, a smile spreading across her face. That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing the day's events, Walter shook his head in amazement. "If I hadn't seen these things with my own eyes over the past weeks, I wouldn't have believed them possible," he admitted. A wild bear trusting humans. Bear cubs playing with puppies. Our old Buddy teaching them all how to get along. It's like something out of a fable. Helen nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. "It makes you wonder how many other bridges could be built between humans and wildlife if we approach them with kindness instead of fear." Walter reached over to squeeze her hand. "You've always seen the world that way, haven't you? It's one of the things I've always loved about you." Their peaceful existence with Shadow and her cubs might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of the Forest Service truck the following week. Helen was in the garden, clearing space for early spring planting, when she heard the vehicle coming up their long driveway. "Walter," she called toward the barn, where her husband was repairing a chicken coop, "we have company." The truck parked near the house, and two uniformed rangers stepped out. Helen recognized the older one as Jim Thornton, who had worked with Walter years ago. The younger ranger was unfamiliar to her. "Morning, Helen," Jim called, tipping his hat politely. "Is Walter around?" "Right here," Walter replied, emerging from the barn and wiping his hands on a rag. "Good to see you, Jim. What brings you out our way?" Jim's expression grew serious. "We've had reports of a black bear sighting in this area. Female with cubs. Probably looking for food after hibernation was disrupted by that January thaw we had. Figured we'd check with you folks first, being on the edge of the forest and all." Helen and Walter exchanged a quick glance, silently communicating their dilemma. They had done nothing illegal in helping Shadow and her cubs, but they knew that official protocol would likely mean relocation for the bear family, a disruption that might do more harm than good at this point. "Any particular reason for concern?" Walter asked carefully. "Bears pass through these parts all the time." The younger ranger spoke up. "This one was spotted pretty close to the Miller property last week. They've got young kids, so they're understandably nervous. Protocol says we need to trap and relocate if there's potential for human-wildlife conflict." Helen felt her heart sink. The Millers lived about 2 miles down the road, close enough that it could indeed have been Shadow they'd spotted during one of her foraging trips. Walter nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the protocol. But before you set any traps, would you mind if I showed you something?" Jim looked curious. "What's that, old friend?" "It's easier to show than tell," Walter said. If you gentlemen would follow me. With some trepidation, Helen followed as Walter led the rangers toward the yard, where at that moment the bear cubs and retriever puppies were engaged in one of their now regular play sessions. Buddy lay nearby on the porch, watchful as always, while Shadow rested in the shade of a pine tree at the edge of the clearing. The younger ranger instinctively reached for his tranquilizer gun, but Jim placed a restraining hand on his arm, his eyes wide with astonishment at the scene before them. "What in the world?" he murmured. Walter quietly explained their unexpected relationship with Shadow and her cubs, from finding them in the woodshed during the storm to the remarkable bond that had formed between the wild and domestic animals. "She's never shown any aggression," he concluded. "Not toward us. Not toward Buddy or his puppies. She's just a mother trying to raise her young, Jim. And she's doing it peacefully. Right here." Jim removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair as he processed what he was seeing. "In 30 years as a ranger, I've never witnessed anything like this," he admitted. "But Walter, you know as well as I do that wild animals are unpredictable." "If she were to harm someone, she won't," Helen said with quiet conviction. "She's had every opportunity to do so over the past month, and has chosen peace instead. She's different, Jim. Special." The younger ranger, who had been watching the playing animals with fascination, finally spoke. "What if we monitored the situation instead of intervening immediately?" he suggested. "Regular check-ins. Maybe some tracking to ensure she stays away from other residential areas. It could be valuable from a research perspective, seeing this kind of interspecies behavior." Jim considered this, looking from the hopeful faces of Helen and Walter to the peaceful scene in the yard. "Against my better judgment," he finally said, "we'll try your suggestion, Ranger Evans." But he added, turning to Walter and Helen, "At the first sign of any problematic behavior, you call us immediately." "Understood." "Absolutely," Walter agreed, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, Jim." As the rangers prepared to leave, the younger one, Evans, lingered for a moment, watching as Smokey and one of the puppies engaged in a gentle tug-of-war with Buddy's rope toy. "This is something special you have here," he said softly. "Something worth protecting." Helen smiled at him, sensing an ally. "We think so too." After the rangers left, Helen and Walter stood together at the edge of the yard, watching their unusual extended family. "That was close," Helen murmured. "Do you think they'll really let her stay?" Walter slipped an arm around her shoulders. "Jim's a good man. If he says they'll monitor rather than intervene, that's what they'll do. But we'll need to be extra vigilant, make sure Shadow doesn't wander too close to other properties." Helen nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I just want them to have a chance, Walter. All of them." "I know, love," he said, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "So do I." The fragile peace they had established was tested sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after the rangers' visit, a late winter storm system moved in, bringing heavy snow and bitter temperatures that hadn't been seen since January. The weather forecast warned of potentially dangerous conditions lasting several days. "I'm worried about Shadow," Helen confessed as they prepared for the storm, stocking up on supplies and ensuring all their animals were securely sheltered. "She's been venturing further into the forest each day to forage. What if she gets caught in the storm?" Walter shared her concern but tried to remain practical. "She's a wild animal, Helen. She has instincts for this kind of situation. The best thing we can do is make sure there's shelter and food available if she needs it." They reinforced the woodshed, adding extra hay for insulation and leaving a generous supply of food just inside the door. Buddy seemed to sense their worry, staying close to the shed and occasionally looking toward the forest with perked ears, as if listening for Shadow's return. The storm hit that night with unexpected ferocity. Wind howled around the farmhouse, driving snow against the windows in blinding sheets. Helen stood at the kitchen window, straining to see the woodshed through the swirling white, but visibility was near zero. "She'll be all right," Walter said, though his own voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Bears are built for winter weather." "Not when they're undernourished and have cubs to feed," Helen replied softly. She should have been hibernating all this time, not struggling to survive with 2 babies. As the night wore on, they checked on the puppies in their warm corner of the barn, making sure the heating lamp was functioning properly. Buddy, however, refused to come inside the house. He stationed himself on the porch, facing the direction of the forest, occasionally letting out a low whine that tugged at Helen's heart. "He's worried about them too," she said, wrapping a warm blanket around the old dog's shoulders. Buddy acknowledged her kindness with a brief thump of his tail but maintained his vigilant posture. The storm continued through the night and into the next day with unrelenting intensity. By the second evening, there was still no sign of Shadow. The bear cubs, Smoky and Dusty, remained in the woodshed, growing increasingly distressed without their mother. They whimpered and paced, refusing the food Helen cautiously offered them. "This isn't good, Walter," Helen said as they returned to the house after checking on the cubs. "They're too young to survive without her for long." Walter nodded gravely. "If she doesn't return by tomorrow, we'll need to call Jim. The cubs will need professional wildlife care." That night, Helen slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of Shadow struggling through deep snow, trying desperately to return to her cubs. She woke several times, each time going to the window to check for any sign of the bear's return. The storm continued to rage, and each time, she saw only Buddy's faithful silhouette on the porch, still watching and waiting. By the third day, the storm had begun to weaken, though snow still fell steadily. The cubs were growing weak from hunger and distress. Even the puppies seemed subdued, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Buddy had barely left his post on the porch, accepting food and water when offered but refusing to come inside despite the bitter cold. "I can't bear it any longer," Helen said that afternoon, tears in her eyes as she watched the old dog shivering despite the blankets they'd wrapped around him. "Buddy will freeze out there, and those poor cubs." Walter, who had been on the phone with Jim discussing the situation, hung up with a heavy sigh. "Jim says the roads are still too dangerous for them to get through. We're on our own for at least another day." Helen straightened her shoulders, a determined look replacing her tears. "Then we need to do something ourselves. Those cubs need warmth and comfort, even if we can't properly feed them without Shadow." Walter knew better than to argue when his wife had that look in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we bring the puppies to the woodshed," she said. "Their body heat might help keep the cubs warm. And Buddy needs to be with them too." Walter considered this unorthodox plan. The puppy's mother might not take kindly to that arrangement. "She's comfortable with the cubs now," Helen countered. "She's seen them playing together for weeks, and she trusts Buddy's judgment." After some discussion, they decided to try. They carefully transported the 5 puppies to the woodshed, bringing their bedding and the heating lamp from the barn. The puppy's mother, a gentle retriever named Lady, followed anxiously but seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. Inside the shed, the bear cubs huddled together in the corner, their usual playfulness replaced by lethargy and distress. Buddy entered first, approaching them with gentle whines of reassurance. To Helen and Walter's amazement, he then lay down beside the cubs, his warm body creating a barrier between them and the cold air that seeped through the shed walls. The puppies, after some initial hesitation, followed their grandfather's example. They curled up around and between the bear cubs, their golden fur mingling with the black in a living blanket of warmth. Lady, after circling the unusual group several times, finally settled beside Buddy, adding her warmth to the collective effort. "Would you look at that?" Walter whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "They're all taking care of each other." Helen couldn't speak, her heart too full as she watched this extraordinary display of compassion across species. She merely nodded, squeezing Walter's hand tightly. They left the animals together, checking back frequently throughout the evening. Each time, they found the unlikely family huddled together, sharing warmth and comfort in the face of crisis. The bear cubs, drawing strength from the presence of their canine friends, finally accepted some of the food Helen offered, though they still whimpered occasionally for their mother. That night, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, the snowfall ceased, and stars appeared in the clear, cold sky. Helen and Walter took turns keeping watch from the porch, hoping against hope for Shadow's return. It was just before dawn on the fourth day when Walter, taking the early morning watch, spotted movement at the forest's edge. He squinted through the dim light, then quickly called for Helen. "I think it's her," he said as his wife joined him, wrapping her robe tightly around herself against the pre-dawn chill. They watched together as a dark shape moved laboriously through the deep snow, heading directly toward the farmhouse. As it drew closer, their hopes were confirmed. It was indeed Shadow, though she moved with even more difficulty than usual, her fur matted and coated with ice, her body visibly thinner than when she'd left. "She made it," Helen breathed, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. That remarkable creature made it back to her babies. Buddy, who had come out to join them on the porch, let out a soft woof of recognition and bounded through the snow toward the approaching bear. Shadow paused, lifting her head wearily as the golden retriever approached. There was no fear, no aggression, only what appeared to be profound relief. As Buddy reached her side, what happened next would remain etched in Helen and Walter's memories for the rest of their lives. Shadow, the wild black bear who had come to trust them with her most precious possessions, lowered her great head and gently touched her nose to Buddy's, a gesture that transcended species, a thank you that needed no translation. Together, the bear and the dog made their way to the woodshed, where Shadow's cubs greeted her return with renewed energy and joyful whimpers. The puppies, seemingly understanding that their emergency service was complete, respectfully gave the bear family space for their reunion. Helen and Walter observed from a distance, their hearts full as they witnessed this miracle of trust and connection. Shadow was home, and against all odds, her family was intact. In the days that followed, Shadow regained her strength rapidly. The bear family continued to inhabit the woodshed, but it was clear that as spring approached, they would soon return to their natural habitat in the forest. The cubs grew more adventurous daily, exploring further from the shed under their mother's watchful eye, their play with the puppies growing more robust as their strength returned. Ranger Evans visited regularly, taking notes and photographs of the unusual interspecies interactions. "This could change how we think about wildlife management," he told Helen and Walter during one visit. "The capacity for coexistence, for understanding across species barriers, it's remarkable." Helen smiled as she watched Smokey and Dusty wrestling playfully with the puppies under the supervision of both Buddy and Shadow. "It just takes a little kindness," she said, "and a willingness to see beyond our differences." As March progressed and the first hints of spring began to emerge from beneath the melting snow, the inevitable day arrived. Helen and Walter woke one morning to find the woodshed empty. Shadow had led her cubs back to the forest during the night, beginning the next chapter of their wild lives. "I knew this day was coming," Helen said as they stood together at the edge of their property, looking toward the forest. "But I didn't expect it to hurt quite so much." Walter put his arm around her shoulders. "They needed to go back to their world, just as we need to stay in ours." "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. Before Walter could answer, Buddy gave a soft bark from beside them. The old retriever was looking intently toward the tree-line, his tail wagging slowly. Following his gaze, they saw her, Shadow, standing at the forest edge, her cubs beside her. She was looking directly at the humans and their dog, her posture alert but relaxed. For a long moment, the two families regarded each other across the divide between their worlds. Then Shadow seemed to nod, a gesture so human-like that Helen gasped softly. The great bear turned, leading her cubs deeper into the forest, but just before disappearing among the trees, she paused for one final look back at the place and the beings who had helped her family survive. "Yes," Walter said, answering Helen's question at last. "I think we'll see them again." He was right. As spring bloomed into summer, Shadow and her cubs were occasionally spotted at the forest edge, watching the farm from a distance. Sometimes, when Helen worked in her garden in the cool of the evening, she would look up to find Dusty, the more timid of the cubs, observing her curiously from the safety of the trees. And on rare, special nights, Shadow herself would emerge from the forest to sit quietly at the yard's perimeter, watching as Buddy napped on the porch in the golden light of the sunset. She never approached the house directly anymore, never sought food or shelter. Her visits seemed motivated by something deeper, something that transcended the practical needs that had initially brought her to the human's door. She remembers, Helen said one such evening as they watched from the kitchen window. She knows this was once home. Walter nodded, his arm around his wife's waist. "And to us, she'll always be family." Buddy, despite his advancing age, continued to serve as a bridge between the two worlds. When Shadow visited, he would often leave the porch to sit at a respectful distance from her, the two old souls communing in a language without words. The puppies, growing rapidly toward adulthood, learned from his example, approaching wildlife with curiosity rather than fear or aggression. As the seasons turned and years passed, Shadow's visits became less frequent, though the story of the bear family and their unusual bond with the humans and their dog became something of a legend in the local community. Ranger Evans, now promoted to senior wildlife officer, used their experience to advocate for more compassionate approaches to human-wildlife conflicts. Helen and Walter continued their quiet life on the edge of the forest, growing older alongside their faithful Buddy. They watched as their grandchildren played in the same yard where once bear cubs and puppies had tumbled together in unlikely friendship. They told the story again and again, of Shadow's trust, of Buddy's wisdom, of a winter when the boundaries between wild and tame had blurred, revealing something profound about the capacity for connection across all barriers. And sometimes, in the soft light of dusk, they would catch a glimpse of a large black shape at the forest's edge, Shadow, older now like them, still remembering, still acknowledging the bond that had formed in that desperate winter and had never truly broken. Love, Helen would say softly on these occasions, is the one force that truly bridges different worlds. Walter would squeeze her hand in agreement, and Buddy would wag his tail, as if in affirmation of this simple truth. That compassion, once offered and accepted, creates connections that endure beyond all expectation, writing new stories of possibility in the ancient, ongoing dialogue between humankind and the wild.